All right, we're going to get started right now. So again, if you can, please turn your cameras on if they're not already. I'm Miriam Green, Director of Marketing and Alumni Affairs. Thank you for joining us this evening for the Hebrew University Alumni Association's Torch Talks event. The HU Alumni Association seeks to engage all HU alumni in the U.S. to foster a lifelong connection to the university and to connect fellow alumni around the country. And even before we were all social distancing, we have been and will continue to have these talks and more events as a way to bring our alumni community together. There are many ways you can get involved with us, from participating in future events, attending or hosting future online events, or when we can all be together in person again, sharing your alumni story and photos, letting us know about job openings so that we can put them on our alumni job board, and giving to the Alumni Annual Fund, which supports student scholarships at the university, which are always needed. To learn more, please email alumni@afhu.org. Our next event will be a special presentation of the new hit Facebook game, Who Knows One, featuring Rothberg alumni on our Facebook page on February 7th at 1 p.m. Eastern. Consider it a forspice to the Super Bowl. For those unfamiliar with the game, it works on the basis of 6 degrees of separation in Jewish geography. You have 2 contestants that compete against each other to find a name known as the chosen one, and whoever can bring that chosen one into the game first wins. You can watch it again on our Facebook page at facebook.com/Hebrew University Alumni. Following that, our next talk will be on February 11th, just in time for Valentine's Day, featuring HU Professor Eliakim Kislev discussing the stigma against singles. Very romantic. And on February 28th at 1 p.m., join HU on campus from the comfort of your couch. The 2021 Olive Conference will transport attendees to HU for a day of learning, insight, and education. A portal to tomorrow, bringing the Hebrew University of Jerusalem to you, brings together researchers and academics from the university to discuss their works in fields ranging from health, agriculture, and nanotechnology to the humanities, environment, and life sciences. The conference showcases Israeli innovations that are shaping our global tomorrow. The researchers that are going to be there is a great lineup, so please register. So to learn more about these events and to register, please visit afhu.org/events. Today, we are in for a treat. As you might have noticed, everyone will be on mute during the presentation, but because this is meant to be a conversation, we will be taking questions throughout. To submit a question, please type it in the chat box and we will do our best to answer as many as we can. I'm now pleased to introduce HU alumna Rachael Cerrotti. Rachael is an award-winning photographer, writer, educator, and audio producer based in Portland, Maine. Her work focuses on exploring the intergenerational impact of memory and migration. For over a decade, she has been retracing her grandmother's Holocaust survival story and documenting the echoes of World War II. In the fall of 2019, she released a podcast titled We Share the Same Sky about this story. And if you have not had a chance to listen to it yet, I highly recommend it because it's amazing. The podcast was the first ever documentary podcast to be based on a Holocaust survivor's testimony. It was produced for the USC Shoah Foundation and listed as one of the best podcasts of 2019 by the Huffington Post. The podcast is now being used in high school classrooms around the United States, supplemented by companion educational materials developed by Echoes and Reflections. Rachael has worked in over a dozen countries, and her work has been published and featured by NPR, PRI's The World, WBUR, GBH, amongst others, as well as podcasts such as Kind World and Israel Story. She regularly presents to communities and classrooms worldwide, from audiences at embassies in Europe to public schools in America. Rachael has a forthcoming memoir set to be published this August and is producing 2 new podcasts for the USC Shoah Foundation. Rachael, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be here with Hebrew University family. Full disclosure, I have a 3.5-month puppy in my house right now who's currently on my lap. So if you see some erratic movements or puppy moving around, that's why. She's still learning how to live here. So it's so nice to be with all of you. I imagine some of you might be familiar with the story if you've listened to the podcast. For other of you, it'll be brand new. Puppy's going down now. And I'm looking forward to sharing this with you. And since this talk is really going to look at family history and how to record family history, I am going to try to gear telling the story to talking about what type of medias I've used and how I've approached going into my grandmother's war story. So I'm going to start off here. Let's get my computer going. Okay. So I'm going to start off with a youngin' picture of me with my grandmother and my younger brother circa 1992-ish. And I'm going to read a small excerpt of a letter that she sent to me in 1992. So I was 3 years old at the time. So the ages, I know what age I am. And my grandmother wrote to me in this handwriting that you see in the back here. I often think how lucky I am, how lucky Ima is, how lucky you are having such a loving extended family. Your Ima didn't have the pleasure for nor the luxury of having grandparents. She, as well as your aunt and uncle, had only a nuclear family. When you're much older and I'm still around, I'll tell you about it. The world was bad, crazy, and vengeful then. And today, half a century later, it's no better by much. People will always fight for one reason or another and kill each other. We're in August 1992. We had presidential elections. George Bush is president and wants to be again next term. Bill Clinton, a Democrat, is running against him. The 25th Olympic Games are taking place in Barcelona, Spain. In Somalia, children by the hundreds are dying of hunger and illness. Israel has a new prime minister, Rabin, who is more willing to give in to Palestinians' demands than his predecessor, Shamir, was. There's a terrible civil war in Yugoslavia. Serbs are killing Croats and vice versa. Small children are killed and are separated from your parents for no reason and no fault. They didn't do anything bad. You are lucky to live in a country where you are protected by us all. So I like to start with this because when I found this letter as an adult, I couldn't believe that my grandmother wrote me this when I was 3 years old. And I think it also is a nice example of the way in which she wanted to not only tell me her story, but tell me the story of the world around me, which was to put it in this larger global context. And as I move into telling you a bit about how I've documented my own family history, you're going to certainly see that as a theme play out. And I can thank her for that worldly perspective, I guess you could say. So my grandmother loved to write. These are scans of that letter, as well as one that she wrote to my brother. And this is how I knew my grandmother. So, you know, she was wise and she was a Holocaust survivor, but she was also my grandmother who ate fire. And so, you know, I think it's really important that even though now I spend a lot of time sitting in the history of the Holocaust and with other communities of people who've gone through genocide and terrible wars, my kind of journey into this field and into this topic really started with a vivacious grandmother, and that's how I knew her as a granddaughter, was the wild one who ate fire. And also for my bat mitzvah, she like dyed her hair green, and just she was a crazy grandmother, and that's still often how I remember her. So I like to show her to start off in the way in which I knew her growing up. So in 2009-ish, around there, which is when I went off to Hebrew U for my year abroad, I was there from 2009 to 2010. I was kind of a struggling college student. I was going into my junior year. I wasn't doing all that great with the college culture here in America, and my journey to Hebrew U was partly because I had fallen in love with Israel on a birthright trip. I was one of those who totally got hooked by Taglit. And also I was so dedicated to being a photojournalist. That was like the only thing I could think about in my life. And as a young photojournalist, or as a young storyteller in the professional documentary world, you're told by those older and wiser than you to pick a story and start a blog. At least that was the advice then. So I did those two things. I picked a story and I started a blog, and the story I picked was my grandmother. And part of it was because I knew she had this epic story. My grandmother was a survivor who talked publicly quite often. She would speak to book groups and synagogue groups and school children and museums, and whoever asked her to tell her story, she would always tell it. And similar to how she wrote me that letter, she would tell it in the context of what made sense of the day. So she was really a gifted storyteller. And I always say that if she grew up in a different time and place, maybe she would have pursued the career that I have the privilege of being in now. So I said to my grandmother, I said, hey, will you tell me your story? I want to write it all down. And she said, oh, you've heard it before. And I said, let's just do it. And, it was kind of twofold. Part of it was a little bit strategic on my end. I was like, oh, here's a story that nobody else can tell, that I was really interested in, but also my grandmother was near the end of her life. I was aware of that. And I really wanted an opportunity to spend one-on-one time with her. So that was my larger intention. And so we started these storytelling sessions where she would talk and I would write. And from the first day, she said to me, because I was in the midst of traveling a lot, I was a college student, she said to me, Rachel, the biggest difference between your travels and mine is that I had to burn all of my bridges as I move forward. And I've clung on to this sentence and this statement for my entire life, for this whole journey of still being in her war story, which I frankly, at that time in 2009, when I first asked her to begin chatting with me, really didn't think it was gonna be much more than like a nice time to hear my grandmother's history. And now over a decade later, my world is a world that I've journeyed into because of her story. And I think about this statement a lot because I don't think it's true. I think she certainly felt it as true, but in my research, as I'm gonna tell you this evening, I found many of those bridges as I went out to research my family history. So my grandmother passed away a year later. Hannah, her name was Hannah, and she died in October 2010. So we just passed her 10th yard site. And after she passed away, I found that she left behind this beautiful archive of her history. And it wasn't like some secret archive, but it was an archive that I didn't know about. And it was so beautifully curated. And I kind of just dubbed myself unofficial family historian, slowly started accumulating boxes in my apartment. And I was living in Philly at the time, which is where I graduated college from, and moved back to Boston, which is where I'm from originally, and started taking stuff with me and, pushing my mom to give me whatever she could find, and same with my aunts and uncles. And within all of that, I found this folder that said for Rachel and Jesse. Jesse's my brother. So you'll know a little about my life when I was your age. And so not only did my grandmother record her story for herself, but she also really left it behind intentionally for others. And so I know from the get-go that this is quite different than the situation in other people's families. So I know that I'm lucky from the start because my grandmother really made a point to save what she could as the years went on, and was able to. And I'll tell you a little bit about how she survived the war and was able to save certain documents, photographs, and the like. So within this archive, I found beautiful photographs, albums dating back to the 1920s. These are pictures of her with her mother. My grandmother was from Czechoslovakia. She was born in a small town called Kolín, and when she was 1 year old, moved to Prague. I have a dog tearing up my carpet right now, but I'm just gonna let her be. So this is my grandmother and her younger brother, Peter. They've about the same age difference as me and my brother do, about 3 years or so. And this photo is taken summer of 1939. So after the Nazis had occupied Czechoslovakia, but before the war had officially begun. This is my great grandparents, their wedding photo taken in the early 1920s, around circa 1924-ish. And then this is a beautiful photograph, which was one of my grandmother's favorite photographs of 4 generations of women, my grandmother being the youngest. And I'm gonna come back to this photo at the end of the presentation. So just log it away in your mind. So within this archive was also all types of primary source documents, immigration papers, drawings. As you see, that's her brother, a drawing of him in 1939, papers from when she got to America, papers from Prague, photographs of her in school, report cards. I mean, it was really quite remarkable to be able to see this type of information. And so I became obsessed. And after I graduated college and I was like living back in Boston, and I was still pursuing photojournalism, but I was also working as a waitress and in the travel industry. I was staffing birthright trips, and I was kind of doing all the odd jobs and things that one has to do when they're pursuing the creative arts. And in all my spare time, I was obsessively going through every single piece of paper and digitizing everything. I retyped every piece of writing, took it from her notebooks, took her diaries. My mom and I had things translated, and luckily I come from two parents who also find family history very interesting. So I certainly give them a lot of credit for me falling into this field. And I was really interested in communities of displacement at this time. So I really came into this history through being really, curious about what it meant to be stateless. And my grandmother was stateless for 17 years, from 1939 when she lost her Czech citizenship to 1956 when she became an American. And so that really was my core. That's what I was focused on. And so as I was going through all these papers and digitizing and scanning and typing and searching and reading and starting to read textbooks for fun about World War II and whatnot, which I know is a rare statement to hear someone say, I was paying attention to where she was during what year, who she was with, how did she get from one place to another. So here is a photograph of my great-grandparents and my grandmother's brother in 1941. I don't know how this photograph was taken in 1941 because the war, Czechoslovakia, Prague was not a place where you would assume there would be street photography like this, especially for Jewish people. When you think about going into family history, this was sitting in a photo album with 1941 written over it. I can't prove that this photo is 1941. Maybe it was 1939 or 1938, but from the looks of them, 1941 sounds right. But these are the types of questions I had to ask myself going into this information was, what perhaps could be mislabeled, or what maybe was misinformation, and then trying to sort through what that mattered in my storytelling, and not only my forward-facing storytelling, but also, my personal storytelling to myself and with my family. Next to this picture, you'll see a transport document sending Hannah's brother to Theresienstadt, I believe it was, and her father, deporting them. And so, I know the end of the story before it begins. And every time I teach this story to my students, I always have to remind them, when we go into a story of history and what happens at the end, you have to remind yourself that the people going through it, the characters of your past, didn't know what was happening at the time. So you go into this, into this duality in your head of trying to think like the characters did. Characters is a funny word to use for your own family. That's kind of what it becomes, though, in some circumstances. As well as what we think about it now, and then decide how to tell that story from whose perspective. So as I started digging deeper and deeper into this history, I started to pair words together with photographs and think about, it's editorializing. So it's interesting. So my grandmother said to me, I last saw my parents on the platform of the train station. I thought the war will be over soon. I never believed, I don't think they ever believed, that this is the last time that we would see each other. So this is the photograph that I have of them at the last time that they were together, as far as the archive tells me. Next to this is a photograph of Prague that I took of the train station there. The older building there on the left is what it would have looked like then. And so I started pairing things together to think about how can the story feel not complete, but more full in certain ways. And so this is my interpretation and my editorializing of my own family history. So as I was going through all of this material, I started conceptualizing this big project where I was like, I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna retrace my grandmother's history, and I'm gonna pack up all my bags and go on the road and be like kind of a nomadic journalist. And that's what I did. And so I did a crowdfunding campaign, raised a little bit of money. And in 2014, I subletted my apartment and I went on the road and began to follow my grandmother's story of statelessness. So I was really intentional about wanting to go to the places where she lived, live the type of lives within reason. I understood that my identity was very different, and the period of history was very different, of course. But I really wanted to see, as I think at that time I was using the phrase, I wanted to see the languages, landscapes, and lives that my grandmother did. And my grandmother had a bit of a different war story than I had heard others, as in she wasn't in a camp, even though her whole family was murdered in camps, she was able to escape. And so I started in Czechoslovakia, in Czech Republic, as it is now, in Prague. And I ended up staying with a member of the Jewish community there, who very generously hosted me, because part of my intention was, well, my grandmother was saved by strangers during the war. And so I wanted to, as much as I could, find people to host me, and also, rely on the kindness of strangers. But so in Czech Republic, I really was intentional about going to the places where I felt like my grandmother would be. So I was raised in a Reformed Jewish community in Boston, and my grandmother was raised in something that would be kind of similar, I guess, in Prague. She wasn't very religious, as she said, but quite culturally Jewish, and very engaged in the Jewish community. And so I started going every Friday night. I would go to different services at different synagogues, and I would meet different people from the local Jewish community. This photo on the left here is one of the buildings she lived in. The photo on the right is a prayer book, which is funny because Czech language was very confusing for me. But as soon as I saw the transliteration to Hebrew, even though I'm not fluent in Hebrew, but I'm okay, suddenly, like, it was the only way the language could kind of make sense to me, as if I looked at it via the Hebrew letters. So that was interesting. So this idea of, like, I wanted to touch the past, and I wanted to touch my family history, not only literally, but like from a cultural landscape point of view. And that's really what I did in the Czech Republic. And I also wanted to learn about the Czech Republic as a country, because that was a part of my own history. So top right here, you're going to see a photo from the 25th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution. So really thinking about the fact that after the war, Czechoslovakia was ran by communists, and it was, part of the Soviet Union. So it had such a different culture, and there was a reason my grandmother didn't stay there after the war. And I know I'm jumping the story here, but I want to talk about this from the idea of documenting family history, and the importance of thinking about what these countries are like not only what was my grandmother's life like, but really what was the context of which her memories lived within, which in her life was, as well as the little pieces of her life that were still alive at the end of the war. What did that feel like for her to watch Czechoslovakia become what it was after the war, after she knew it as a democracy when she was younger. On the bottom left here, you'll see a statue of Nicholas Winton, which, who was, part of organizing the Kindertransport. And looking at some of the other ways that the war is memorialized, a lot of finding my family history was through names on the wall, which is what many descendants will find. And so that was part of the documenting also. And I share this because I've been very lucky to have a lot of life still in my grandmother's survival story. And you'll meet some of those characters as I go through the story. But also, a lot of documenting it is just documenting the memory that still exists there. So from Czechoslovakia, or from Czech Republic, I left because that's what my grandmother did. So in 1939, sorry, you're gonna hear a little squeaking from my dog. I apologize, it won't last long. But in 1939, my grandmother was 14 years old, and she was a member of the Zionist youth movement. And that's really how she was able to get out of Prague, was that there was a cohort of young Czech Jewish teens who were accepted into a Hakshara program, preparation program, with intention to go to Palestine, and they were being taken from Czechoslovakia to Denmark, which at that point was not occupied. So they went by train from Czechoslovakia. She left from Prague, the train station you saw earlier, through Germany, with a checkpoint in Berlin, and eventually made it to Warnemünde, which is this picture of the coast you see here. And they cross the Baltic Sea by boat, and they make it to Denmark. And so now they're safe safe to an extent for the moment. And when they get to Denmark, all the kids, the young people, are placed on farms, on foster farms, with the intention of learning agricultural skills and eventually moving on to Palestine. Once again, I'm very lucky to have some of this stuff. So part of what was in the archive was these letters that were sent from Hannah, from my grandmother, to her parents during the war. And you can see on the back of them the swastika, because all correspondence was censored by the Nazis during this time. So she told me that, you know, there were oftentimes sentences blacked out, but at least they knew the other one was alive and you know, well, whatever that means at that time for them. They knew they were there on the other side to open the letter. So each of these young people were placed on these foster farms for contracts of 6 months. And, you know, they thought that they would be on one farm and then, you know, go on to Palestine. And then in April 1940, Denmark is then occupied by the Nazis. So Hannah is living on different foster farms, some of them friendlier than others. Some of them she, you know, is miserable. Sometimes she feels okay. You know, not only is she, you know, being challenged by suddenly being, you know, ripped from her home in urban Prague to the middle of the country in you know, landscape and a language she doesn't know, but she's also going through all the teenage problems that anybody does, you know, and we have some of her diaries from this period of time, and it always makes me laugh that, like, when you go through them, you would barely know there's a war, because most of the diaries are, you know, I like this boy, why doesn't he like me? This friend is stupid. I like this girl, why isn't she calling me? I want to see her. But she had this group of friends, these you know, they call themselves the Chaverim, these young Zionists who wanted to eventually make it to Palestine. And they would see each other every couple of weeks and get to, you know, gossip together in their native language and compare how much they were, you know, how much Danish they were learning, and also they were learning Hebrew and all these things. So I love these photographs because, you know, I teach these pictures. I bring them into my classroom, and, you know, not just with young people, but also with adults as well. And, you know, when I ask people, say, what do you see in these photographs? It is very rare that anybody says refugees. And so, you know, I think part of the reason I went out to do this research was trying to understand, what does this history even mean to me? Like, why does this matter? And I think it's this ongoing question that we often all ask ourselves. And, oh, I'm sorry, I have to take this away from her. Here, she left. Sorry about that. Just eating little things. You know, so, you know, often ask ourselves, like, what is the point? And, you know, there's these, with learning these photographs, it's like, well, this gives you context of what we talk about when we talk about refugees today, right? We're talking about young people, we're talking about teenagers, we're talking about kids from families themselves. And so for me, that was a big part, was like trying to understand, like, what my grandmother's history could teach me about the world today. So there was this element of, like, yes, I wanted to know the family history because it's interesting to know where I come from. But I think there was this larger thing for me of wanting to understand, like, how knowing who I am and where I come from can change the way in which I see the world. And, you know, it's interesting because in that sense, knowing all the specific details of where she was when, of course, helps me get to the deeper part of the story. But that's not, like, where the messaging lives. It's a little bit more in the broad, like, you know, 40,000 foot point of view. But yeah, I also think these photographs are beautiful. So then once again, I'm, you know, pairing these photographs with diaries. You know, so this is a diary entry from my grandmother in 1940. So about a year after she gets to Denmark. So all those things one once had and took for granted become so precious when we lose them. And then we are sorry for not acknowledging them and not making the most of them. The same goes for me. Only now that I am abroad, I can see what motherly love meant to me. Not that I wouldn't be independent or miss her helpful hands at work. No, there's something else that's lacking, and that's a mother herself. I think that especially in my age, when I'm growing up, I need a mother the most. You know, so I start to kind of understand a little bit more about what she's what she's feeling at this time, and what, this idea that, like, not knowing what you have until it's gone, of course, hits, it's hard, especially when kind of a big portion of her diary, as I said before, was a lot about teenage gossip. And then you see an entry like this, and yeah, it's makes it quite emotional. So then there were other diary entries. So now about a year after that or so, she writes, she's about 16 now. You cannot imagine how important is a place, where people live, how much influence it gives, how it is transforming. Here I am walking every day and singing, and I do not miss anything. Of course, it is not perfect, but when I came here, I felt like home. It's so fine, like at home, so fine, so trustful and open. I don't have any other word than home. And so my grandmother wrote this piece, actually in a letter, not in her diary, to her parents in July 1941. So we know they're still corresponding at this time. And this is really one of the last correspondence I have between her and her parents. And she's referring to this new home that she moves into. And at this point, she's gone through all this reflection of, why am I not in Palestine? Why are they not sending us yet? Because certain kids got to go and others didn't. Because, as the war got on, it was harder and harder to travel. So she kind of understands at this point she's stuck in Denmark, and she had come from this family that really wasn't treating her all that great. Really, she was a servant because she was working for these families in exchange for room and board. And then she moves in with this other family who she's writing about. And, what I love about this passage is that, yes, there's something, of course, it's important to know that my grandmother was feeling, good at this point in spite of the circumstances, but there's this deeper messaging here of just like, that certainly makes me reflect on my own life of just like, yeah, how important is a place, and where you are and how it changes you. And I love that she was like able to give that insight even in the context of what she was living through. So getting back into my own travels, through the beautiful web of journalism that I won't go too deeply into right now for the sake of time, I end up in 2012 having the opportunity to meet the woman that she's referring to in this previous piece of writing, which she was at this woman, Jensine Newgard's home, who's this older woman in the bottom here in both photographs. And my mom got to meet her first, and then I got to meet her in 2013. And at this point, we realized that this woman has been passing down the story of my grandmother to her kids and her grandkids for all these years, and saved letters from my grandmother. And it was this moment where I had gone out, at this point, this was still fairly early in my research. It was before I went on my year of travels, which would become many years of travel. And she, I'm realizing that, like, I went out with this very possessive idea of like, this is my family history and this is like my story. And it was really, about us. And then it was just this very humbling moment of like, it's not really about us. It's about, it's not about me. It's about all of us. Because here's my grandmother's story being passed from one generation to the next, just like it was given to me, but from a different perspective, a different language, a different historical context. And this family had passed this story down because it was a good story in their family, which is just such a different way to think about that. Because like when you're the descendant of a Holocaust survivor or any war-torn event, it's not a good story, even if someone survives, even if there's some light in the dark, it's not a good story. But the fact that for their family, this was something really important that they did, is that they helped save somebody during this war. And it was just a really beautiful opening of conversation, of friendship, of relationship, and of perspective. So when I went on my year-long travels in 2014, back to when I was being my nomadic journalist self, which lasted many more years than just a year for this project, I reached out to this family and said, I'm trying to like do this very, kind of dedicated journey to retrace my grandmother to the best of my ability. And like, do you have a family member that I could live with? I had reached out to Jensine's son, who was the one who spoke English. He said, oh, you can stay with my niece, Sine. So this is Sine's farm in Denmark. This is Sine. This is Jens Sine's granddaughter. So she is the granddaughter of the woman who saved my grandmother during the war. It's a mouthful, and we would like love to tell that to people when we were together, when they'd be like, how do you know each other? Be like, well, Sine's grandmother, da, da, da. And I essentially had emailed Sine and was like, hey, I'm Rachel, I'm a journalist, da, 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 da. I'm doing this big project, and can I come and live with you? And I want to photograph my time. And she said, sure. And so in February 2015, I moved in with her and her family for 5 weeks. It would be the first of many times I went to go live with them. And I photographed and I wrote and I researched, and there was something very powerful, and which was what I was intending, was that, you know, what would this information, what would this story feel like spending time with it in the place where it originated or where it was from. And it certainly did feel different, because I easily could have taken, with the amount that my grandmother left behind, I could have written a book without ever leaving my bedroom floor in Boston about her story. And while it would have been a compelling book, no doubt, her story did not need anything added to it to be important and worthwhile. That wasn't really the story I wanted to tell. It wasn't really a story I was investing myself in. And I really delved into this from the space of wanting to understand it from a contemporary point of view and wanting to understand how the story was still alive now. And here on Sine's farm, I really got the opportunity to do that. So I spent time with her kids, and, you know, these girls on the bottom and their brother are the great grandchildren. And it was really cool, because living with them, one of my tasks was to cook dinner for the family every night. And, you know, we've built a really lovely relationship now. It's been over 5 years, you know, and like when I was interviewing them for the podcast about this story, you know, my co-producer asked them, you know, what do you remember of when Rachel came to come stay with you? And they're like, oh, we don't remember when she came. She's just been here all along, because that's how young they are. And, you know, I've gone to school with them, and it's cool to think that they're aware of what their great grandmother did because of the conversations that are happening today. And that, I think, is really important, because it just makes everything more tangible and more real when you have more perspectives and more experiences coming together. So this is me with them in 2019. You can see they're a little bit older here. This was, wow, I guess 2 years ago now. And those are Sine's 3 children. In that top corner there, you see my grandmother with their great uncle. So I just think that's pretty cool. That top photo was taken in 1941. And then when I got married, I actually even had my wedding party on Sine's farm. And for those who know the podcast, my husband actually passed away in 2016, just 2 weeks shy of our 1-year anniversary. He was Polish. And the reason, you know, it became a really big part of how I understood my grandmother's story, because, you know, I had gone out as I was 20 when I started this, and, you know, I can kind of see it now, but I was, you know, young and naive in the best way possible and innocent, and Obama had just become president, and it was just such a different time. And, you know, I started when I was 20, and I'm in my 30s now. And so my grandmother's story has really provided a backbone to my life. So when my husband passed away, which was very sudden in 2016 and unexpected, and grief became this really big part of my life, and I had to figure out how to navigate that as it's a lifelong thing for anybody who's gone through a close loss like that. My grandmother's stories became completely different. So I started going through her diaries again and understanding, like I was realizing like how much I had missed the first times over, because not because I was a bad journalist, but because there was no way I could have accessed that. And I started thinking about her parents differently, because I'm really close with my late husband's parents, and watching them grieve like kind of gave me this lens into like what it, you know, not in a compare and contrast way, but from an emotional connection point of view of like what it must have felt like to send your kids away. And so, you know, the reason I go into that is because I think the most remarkable thing about history and family history, especially being that we're so close to it, is that it's like ever evolving, and it doesn't stay still. It's not a statue. It's this thing that it like is constantly transforming with us and how we tell the story. So as I was like going forth and telling my grandmother's story, I had to rethink how I told it. because it felt like the story was different now. I was seeing things in her writing, and I was pulling things out, and I was noticing themes differently. So, by the time 1943 comes and my grandmother's like, becoming more of like a late teenager, and the war is, everything is getting worse and worse, and there's more bloodshed, and so many more countries are involved, and Denmark suddenly is no longer safe. So it would be a whole presentation to go into the rescue of the Danish Jews, but for anybody who knows a bit about it, Denmark saved 95% of their Jewish population during the war with this incredible grassroots rescue operation. So when my grandmother was telling me the story, she said, Rachel, like, this is the most dramatic part coming up, and these are her direct words. She said, one day, a young man I'd never seen before and never after comes to the banker and he says, do you have a Jewish servant here? The banker says, yes, little Hannah. And he came to me and says, do you have a bike? I said, yes. He says, get on the bike and follow me. And by 1943, she's working for a banker's family. And she says, I followed him to a fishing village, to a church. The minister of the church took me up to the bell tower. I was told to wait for the signal and cover my ears when the church bell was rung. Now, this is not the exact church, but anytime I would look at a church in Denmark, I would think about this. And so, when you go out and document family history, I don't believe that things have to be literal. I think that things can very easily be abstract or symbolic as well. She said to me, we ran to the beach. We hid in the sand under the upside down rowboats. The fishermen wanted some financial compensation for bringing us to Sweden. So we got the signal and ran from the upside down rowboats to the fishing boat, which was supposed to take us to Sweden. I knew that the fishermen would not take me. I have no money. I turned my pockets inside out to show the fisherman. He looked me in the eye and said, I didn't ask you, did I? Hop on board. So this becomes another story in my grandmother's story, another piece of my grandmother's story, where an unsung hero saved her life. All these families in Denmark taking her in, they were all heroes of her life. This fishermen, these crossings, just like for those trying to get across the Mediterranean today, these crossings cost a lot of money at this time. And my grandmother had no money. And whether it was pity or goodwill or what the reason was, I don't know. But this fisherman led her on board, and she with 19 other people crossed in the middle of the night from Denmark to Sweden. The boat that my grandmother was on was one of the last boats to leave during this, what was about a 3-week rescue operation. And by this time, there had been some raids in the north, and in the north of Denmark is like on the north of Zealand, which is the island that Copenhagen is on, is really the closest point to Sweden. And Sweden at this point is neutral. And like I said, there's a fascinating history here that I encourage you to think about. And if you want to learn more, I go through it in a whole episode in the podcast. And so it's, by this time she ends up having to go down south, which is a much longer ride. And so it's a big drama saga where the fisherman gets lost. He never sailed further away from the shore. And so my grandmother is telling me about this whole saga, this whole story. And she tells me that there was this famous rabbi's family on the boat with her, named the Melchior family. And so when I get to Denmark, part of my efforts to want to follow is to meet all these people the same way I met with Jensine and her family, is whatever connections I could find, whether they were literal or symbolic, I wanted to meet them. So like when I was in Czech Republic, some of the people I met were directly related to her story. Some people were just members of the Jewish community that could offer me a insight and connections, or, community friendships. And so I wanted to meet Rabbi Melchior, who was still alive. So I wrote to the Jewish community and I said, hi, I'm Rachel, I'm a journalist, I'm doing this story, and my grandmother was on a boat with this family in 1943. So I get connected to this wonderful man, Rabbi Bent Melchior. He's the former chief rabbi of Denmark. And now my adopted grandfather. We are very close now. And he is still alive and well in Copenhagen, and more social than any of us during this pandemic, from what I know from every time I chat with him. And I remember the first time this photo was taken in 2019 after I had interviewed him for the podcast. But when I met him in 2015, which was around the time that I met Sine, it was, I remember like walking into his house and being like, yeah, my grandmother was with you in 1943. And I felt like I had to like prove to him. He doesn't remember this, but I always tell him, I was like, I felt like I had to prove to you that like, you know, my grandmother's with you. And eventually we like compared stories and got it together. And he says to me, you know, I'm still friends with this family in Sweden that found our boat offshore. So I said, there's this long saga and I can't go into it now. So I encourage you to listen to the podcast. But essentially their boat was lingering on the shores of Sweden by chance, with sheer luck, because had they gone to any other country during this time in 1943, they surely would have been killed or deported, something of the like. But rather this fishing family kind of spotted their boat. And so Rabbi Melchior tells me about this. And so a few weeks later, I find myself in Sweden. And so I'm just following all of these traces. And I find myself in the family's house in Sweden. And I know I'm a little short on time here, so I'm gonna cruise a little bit quickly here. And so I meet all these different family members. This man, Per Arne, who passed away a few years ago, he was 6 years old at the time of the rescue and spotted the boat. So he really is an unsung hero himself. As Bent says, he really did a good deed without knowing he did a good deed by running and telling his father about this boat in the sea in 1943. And I spent time in their home, and their home, you know, is another example of a family that I didn't know who's passing down the stories of my grandmother, because it's our story. And I went back to this place with Bent, and when did we go back? In 2017. But Bent had said to me to stand there at the shore, to stand there and realize that had we not at the time reached this place, we would have ended up at the bottom of the sea. So my grandmother, as she's telling me her story, you know, it's like I said, it's about statelessness, displacement. These are themes that are not specific to her story. And around this time that I'm doing all this research, the refugee crisis is breaking out. So, you know, everyone was going somewhere because everyone was a displaced person, particularly people who survived the concentration camp. Now, the first part of that sentence is resonant with many communities today. And when I was traveling in 2015, over 160,000 people had applied for asylum in Sweden. And so knowing some of these statistics and watching the world unfold in front of me in the context of searching, you know, on this like, you know, grand journey to find my family history, really felt like there was this responsibility to look at stories that are resonant today. So I started digging into refugee stories today and meeting young people. These are Hadi and Mahdi, twins who came originally from Afghanistan via Iran up to Sweden. And I, for a number of years, followed their journey as well to becoming citizens of Sweden, and started writing articles and whatnot and collaborating with other journalists. So all these different ways of touching my own family history and in ways that were not so obvious. And that has what's really been keeping me quite engaged. And I'm just gonna play with you. I'm gonna kind of wrap up fairly quickly, Miriam, so we can do some question answer and conversation. But in 2018, when I started working with audio, because you can tell I have photo, I have video of all these different pieces, I got my hands on my grandmother's testimony with Shoah Foundation and made a connection with them, who I now have a very close working relationship with. And it started giving me all these other options of what to do with my family history, including the podcast. So I'll just give you a little sense of my grandmother's voice here.
This picture was even in the newspaper in Prague, and it was, first it was like a quiz show. There are 3 mothers and 3 grandmothers and 3 daughters and 1 great-grandmother and 1 great-granddaughter. How many people all together? And the next day it was like the picture in Prague. So I'm really very proud of that picture, and I'm so happy that I have it. On the right is my great-grandmother, Raichova. Then is my grandmother, my mother's mother, Maria Fialova. Then it's my mother, I think she was 23 years old. Then Emilia Dubova, and then it's me, Hanna Dubova. All except me perished in concentration camp.
So, I mean, it's working with audio, I'll say this, and then I'm gonna pause and I can come back to the information I'm leaving out if it comes up in conversation, because I also wanna see all of your faces. And right now I'm staring at myself in the presentation. But, you know, I think that oftentimes going into family history, there's this, like I said earlier, there's this like possessiveness to it because it's ours, and we are allowed to have that, and we should have that, and we need to take ownership and responsibility and curiosity and love and all these things that come with knowing who we are and who we come from and what our families went through, good and bad. But in all these years of research, I've just been so incredibly humbled by how much I've learned and how much I've accumulated in, in my own, growing my grandmother's archive by people who had no relationship to her story, but helped me understand her story better. Because I know there's a lot of people out there who don't have the type of resource or the type of, living physical, paper archive left down from a past family member. But it sometimes it can be created. So I say that because there's a whole part of this story that I follow my grandmother into America, and we crossed the country by train. And I mean, we're really just skimming the surface here of the travels. And I was on a train across the country and nearing San Francisco at the end of like a 50+ hour train ride. And I ended up chatting with this guy named Steve, who lived in Los Angeles with in San Francisco with his partner. And he starts telling me a bit about his history and tells me he's a painter and he works with the topic of family history. And I tell him my story and da-da-da-da. And about a month later or so, I'm back in Boston having wrapped up some travels, and this picture arrives, which is that he found this photograph online, took it, painted it, and sent me back this beautiful note with this painting framed that pretty much told me about how much it meant to him to sit with these past generations of people. And he has somebody who has no relationship to this history, comes with his own story. And the way that he was able to like bring them to life for me in color and see them differently, I felt was so powerful. And so I really believe that there's this really special connection that lives within family history of being able to share it with other people who might not seem obviously related, who can really help you understand your family history differently. I'm going to pause there. We're getting to the end. I have other resources and stuff we can talk about family history, but I'm going to pause there because I know I've now been talking at the screen for, I think, a solid 40 minutes. So.
Well, thank you very much. We're now going to open up for a full Q&A. So again, if you want to use the chat box or use the raise your hand feature, and I'll try to call on people so that they can actually ask their question and unmute you. So again, you can use the chat box or use the raise your hand feature, and we'll go. And I think, at least one of the first questions that would come to mind for me, Rachel, is, I think you were in a way blessed to have such a treasure trove of archives from your grandmother, but for people who don't, and like they're novices and they're potentially starting from scratch, what are some like suggestions and potential tools, whether their family, went through the Holocaust or not, of what they could do to kind of start trying to uncover their stories?
Absolutely. So I will actually share my screen again for this because I had a slide about that. So good question. So there's a lot of resources out there to go to. I think, I'll speak because I'm working with a lot. Shoah Foundation Archive is an incredible place to go. There's, 55,000 plus testimonies in there. And so even if your family member isn't in there, what's amazing is that you can like type in any keyword. So if you know that your family was from a certain geographical place or had a certain experience group, so Rescue the Danish Jews, for example, I can hear survivors' stories or witness stories. It's not just survivors who come from different perspectives or experiences that can help me understand. Other options, I mean, there's, the obvious options of Ancestry.com, Family Search. Ellis Island. I think newspaper archives are a great place to go to. Military records. A lot of people came by boat, so you can find a lot of boat records. Facebook groups are also a really good place to go sometimes. There's a lot out there and people exchanging information. Academic institutions, libraries, research, I'm saying kind of, just the long laundry list. But I would say that also encourage to think about how history has changed locations. So if your family comes from Poland, well, and in what year? Was it Poland in that time? Like, how was it categorized? Was it Germany or, Russia or, like Lithuania, like all these places have changed borders. So I think doing your research in terms of what was happening geographically and what country, because I was thinking it's like, it's a simple fact, but fascinating that my grandmother was Czech and, her parents were born in Austro-Hungarian Empire. So I think looking at that can be really helpful. And then allowing other people's stories to also fill in some gaps or inspire questions also. I mean, I realize now, like when I was first talking to my grandmother, I had no idea what to ask at all. And so, I think the family search is also a big part of it, is just figuring out what questions to ask is sometimes the biggest thing to tackle.
That's great. And so let's say, you're able to accumulate these resources and some research. What would then be, I guess, how do you find the narrative? Because it seems like, you were able to initially find the narrative with your grandmother's story that obviously, as you said, evolved and changed over time as you also experienced life events yourself. So what would be some tips for, I think, finding that narrative and then being able to pull it together and maybe how to even share it?
Yeah, I think that number one, don't be hard on yourself. Like I still don't know what story I'm trying to tell half the time. I mean, it depends. I try to take a cue from my grandmother. It's like, who are you talking to, right? Like I'm going to tell a different, it's not a different story. I'm going to tell a different part of the story or tell the story differently if I'm talking to a group of fourth graders than college students versus my peers versus people older than me. And I think that's perfectly okay. There's also, I find this to be a fascinating conversation of the difference between history and memory and like, what are you interested in? I know what I know because people talked and shared stories, right? So I think that, our own memories are, it sounds kind of silly, but our own memories are a great resource, and write them down, record them, talk into your phone, whatever, because if you have a generation coming after you, like you are the bridge, right? You're the one who's going to get the story there. So if you have memories of a grandparent or a parent and you're, kind of at a roadblock that there's no other information, record what you know, pass it down, share, interpret, offer some of those tidbits. And I think that like when it comes to actually like packaging it and figuring out how to tell this story, I would say leave a lot of space for that evolving relevance, right? Like when I started this project back in 2009, I didn't really think this story was timely for anyone but the Jewish community. Perhaps some of that was my young age, but I think it's just the way the world has shifted. Like when we look at the past 5-6 years politically, not just in the United States, but all over, politics has really changed. Conversations have changed. Like I don't think World War II and the Holocaust was talked about with the same type of urgency as it has been recently in terms of what does the memory mean. And that's not just because, the concern of survivor generation passing on, but also because the relevance of the lessons. So I think that there has to be space for history to grow with us and to draw different lessons and lean on different lessons at different times.
That's great. And I think actually one thing that you touched on, actually before I do, I just have a very nice comment from our alum, Sarah Siegel, saying that your grandmother was very lucky to have a photojournalist as a granddaughter, and that she's very proud.
Hi, Sarah.
And I think one thing also, so we focused, I would say most of the time of, focused on trying to retrace family history, but when you just spoke, it made me think that, well, you could also be creating it and documenting it for your future, for your current family, and probably, like for future family. So, are there starting off points that, for someone who's like, oh, that maybe I should start doing this too, to kind of, keep my memories of the past, but also my present, that will be someone else's, past later on.
Yeah, pictures with captions. It means everything. Hard copy pictures with captions are incredible. Photo albums are amazing. I am fully confident that if my grandmother's archive was digital, I would not have lasted so long inside of it. There was something really special about the physical paper. And I know it's a different, generation now, even from 11, 12 years ago when I started this. But I think that being able to identify who is who in photographs is really powerful. I would say don't get caught up in worrying about if you're a good writer or a good photographer. My favorite, there's a photograph of my grandmother and her brother that's blurry, and I find it to be one of the most evocative photographs in her archive. I think it's beautiful. I think it's symbolic. So just do not get hung up on oh, I'm not a professional, I can't, or I'm not a good writer. Write in bullet points, write stream of consciousness, talk into your phone. We have these, handy dandy little things in our pockets all the time that is so easy to voice record. They can be literally 1 minute snippets, recipes. I think some of the most meaningful things are not these I love my grandmother's long-winded, beautiful, creative writings. They're gorgeous. But the one sentences here or there are just as remarkable. So just I think it's really overwhelming to think about what to do with information. I get really overwhelmed. I haven't made a personal photo album since I was 21 for my own friends and my own family. And so it's a pep talk for myself as well. Just small bits at a time, print 5 photographs at a time and write on the back of them and put them in an envelope and put them somewhere or in an album.
That's great. Okay, we have a question from Leah Abrahams. Go ahead, Leah.
I really enjoyed your talk, and I agree with you about getting people to record things. A lot of times you can have recorders that are voice activated, and people always say, well, I'm not a good writer, but you can just say to them, just talk when you think of something, and then you can always transcribe it later. The other thing I want to mention is that I come at it from another point of view because I'm a ghostwriter and I help people do their family histories. And one of the most interesting things I thought about this when you were talking is that by the end of the book that I'm working on for them, I feel like I'm part of their family. It's just this really great, most of them are open, they're honest, they trust me, and they tell me stories, and sometimes they say, well, don't put that in the book, but they confide in me, and really, I feel like I know them, I feel like I know their parents, I feel like I know their children and grandchildren. So I'm just urging anyone who has that inclination to think about becoming a personal historian. It's very rewarding.
Yeah. There's also a lot of really cool apps out there right now, like StoryCorps and stuff. There's apps out there that intentionally create questions for one another, and so it's why not just use whatever, there's just the especially with COVID, everyone is embracing the digital world. I think there's a lot of easy ways to get people to one question a day or whatever to open up. But I will say I do think there's also something, my mom and I talk about this quite a bit, that there's something about having a generation in between when sharing family stories. My mom and I talk about I don't think my grandmother would have told her things that she told me, or tried to instill a certain type of wisdom, but I think there was something about the grandparent to grandchild relationship that certainly added to my ability to do this for sure. And my emotional distance from the Holocaust as well, and being able to have that space.
Right. Yeah, we just had a couple people in the chat saying that I know some people want to talk face to face, which is true, as Rachel just said. I think there's so many ways that people can choose to record or tell their stories. And Sarah, again, also just said that she and her wife recorded a StoryCorps story during the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. So she like the StoryCorps is also another idea and way for people to share. So I think that is, we're a little bit over on time now anyways. So if there's any last little questions, we'll try to squeeze them in, but I'll give my ending spiel right now. A really, again, an amazing, huge thank you to Rachael for sharing her story and how she kind of went through the documentation process and some tips. And hopefully, Rachael, if you don't mind, you can share those resources with me, and I will follow up with everyone. And then Neil, I will let you ask your question in a minute. And then just again, for everyone, thank you for joining. And please, if you have more questions or to learn how to get involved, attend more events, you can go to our website, afhu.org, and email alumni@afhu.org. And so now, Neil, I'm going to let you go. There you go.
It wasn't a question, it was actually some applause because I enjoyed it so much.
Oh, good.
Yes, thank you.
I'm sorry I had to rush through then. It's, it's always hard to squeeze all of this in an hour, and then I like linger too much on some things, but there's lots out there if you want to learn more about the story. And I also say that if anyone has questions about curious if your family member is in Shoah Foundation archive, I'd be happy to look that up for you or pass along any resources, or if you have questions, fully welcome you to shoot me an email. I'm super happy to help anyone the way I can get their hands on any type of family history that's out there.
Yeah, so we'll be happy. I'll follow up with emails with a link to this recording, as well as the resources she shared. And I think, again, we just got a request to share the podcast, which is We Share the Same Sky, which again, I forget how many hours it is, but it's truly hours well spent. Absolutely amazing. Get your tissues. We share the same sky, yeah. And get your tissues because it's truly moving. And Rachael's great here, and she's just as great, if not better, also on the podcast. So thank you again, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.